My family stole my inheritance to fund my sister's wedding, so I sued them all. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. I watched my sister raise her champagne glass, completely unaware that the man walking up behind her was about to hand her a felony charge. The crystal chandeliers of the elite Oakwood Country Club fractured the evening light, casting a warm, golden glow over the extravagant rehearsal dinner. My older sister, Brittany, was laughing, tossing her perfectly styled blonde curls as her wealthy fiancé, Mark, smiled adoringly at her. To anyone else, it looked like a fairy tale. To me, it looked like a meticulously funded crime scene. I'm Chloe. I'm 26, I work 60 hours a week as a physical therapist, and I've spent my entire life as the invisible backdrop to the Brittany show. While my mother, Susan, dedicated every waking moment to curating our family's image, I found my solace in my grandfather. He was a pragmatic, hard-working man who saw right through my parents' obsession with keeping up appearances. When he passed away 3 years ago, he left a very specific, ironclad gift, a trust fund containing exactly $150,000. The money was left strictly to me, designated for a down payment on a house, safely locked in an account I couldn't touch until my 25th birthday. It was his way of ensuring I had the stable foundation my parents never provided. I had spent the last year carefully touring modest starter homes, dreaming of the day I would finally turn the key in my own front door. That money represented my independence. It represented the only unconditional love I had ever truly felt in my family. But sitting there at table 4, staring at the extravagant floral arrangements and the imported silk napkins, I felt a physical sickness twisting in my gut. I knew exactly how this lavish event had been paid for. My family hadn't magically won the lottery or suddenly landed a massive promotion. They had simply decided that my future was less important than Brittany's perfect aesthetic. The sheer audacity of their entitlement was breathtaking, but it was about to come crashing down. As the process server in the unassuming gray suit took his final few steps toward the head table, my phone vibrated with a message from my lawyer. It was time to watch my family's perfect facade burn completely to the ground. Growing up, the dynamic in our household was never a secret. Brittany was the undisputed golden child, a former pageant queen who could do no wrong. My mother, Susan, treated her like a prized racehorse, investing every spare dime into vocal lessons, expensive wardrobes, and exclusive cheer camps. I was the practical, quiet younger sister who bought her clothes at thrift stores and paid for her own community college tuition by waiting tables. I accepted my role as the family scapegoat a long time ago. It was easier than fighting a losing battle. But everything escalated to a chaotic new level when Brittany announced her engagement to Mark. Mark was a nice enough guy, but he came from serious generational wealth. His family owned a chain of luxury car dealerships, and their lifestyle was completely foreign to our middle-class reality. The moment the diamond ring slipped onto Brittany's finger, my mother went into full manic mode. She was absolutely terrified of looking inferior to Mark's parents. Suddenly, the modest church wedding Brittany had once talked about was entirely scrapped. In its place emerged a monstrosity of an event, a $100,000 destination-style wedding at the most exclusive country club in the state. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, watching my parents stress over the spreadsheets. My dad's face was gray with anxiety. They were already drowning in a second mortgage and maxed-out credit cards. "We can't afford this, Susan," he had pleaded one evening, staring at an invoice for a $10,000 customized sculpture. Susan had just waved her hand dismissively, her eyes completely glazed over with ambition. "We'll figure it out," she had snapped. "This is Brittany's one special day. We are not going to look like poor trash in front of Mark's parents. I will make sure she gets everything she deserves, no matter what it takes." I should have known then that my mother's definition of whatever it takes would cross major legal boundaries. They were desperate, and desperate people do incredibly dangerous things. I just never imagined they would willingly sacrifice my entire future to pay the wedding bills. The first major red flag dropped during a suffocating, high-end dress fitting 3 weeks before the wedding. Susan had dragged me along to a bridal boutique that served champagne in crystal flutes. Brittany was standing on a pedestal, wearing a custom gown covered in hand-sewn pearls. The price tag dangling from the sleeve made me physically dizzy. It was $12,000. I watched in total disbelief as my mother handed over her platinum credit card without a single moment of hesitation. "Mom, how are you paying for all of this?" I asked quietly while Brittany twirled in the mirror. Susan didn't even look at me. "I told you, Chloe, we are liquidating some old assets. It's handled. Just try to be happy for your sister for once." Liquidating old assets? My parents didn't have a stock portfolio. They didn't have a vacation home. The only asset they had was the crushing debt on our childhood house. I brushed it off, assuming they had taken out some predatory, high-interest personal loan. But the uneasiness in my stomach refused to fade. 2 days later, the real panic set in. I was sitting in my small apartment, scrolling through my emails, when I noticed an automated message from the National Bank where my grandfather's trust was held. The subject line read, "Confirmation of your recent address change." I frowned, opening the message. It stated that the primary mailing address on my trust account had been successfully updated to my parents' home address. I hadn't authorized any changes. I hadn't even logged into that specific banking portal in over a month. A cold, heavy knot of dread formed in my chest. I immediately grabbed my laptop and tried to log into my online banking to check the trust. My password was instantly rejected. I tried the security questions, but those had been altered too. The system locked me out entirely after 3 failed attempts. I stared at the error message on the screen, feeling a sudden, terrifying rush of adrenaline. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong, and I needed answers immediately. I grabbed my car keys and drove straight to the bank, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I walked into my local bank branch the next morning right when the doors opened. The air conditioning was freezing, but I was sweating through my blouse. I sat down at the desk of a familiar branch manager, a kind woman named Brenda who had helped me set up my checking account years ago. "Hi, Brenda," I said, my voice tight. "I'm locked out of my grandfather's trust portal. Can you pull up the balance for me? I just need to make sure everything is secure." Brenda smiled warmly and typed my information into her computer. "Of course, Chloe. Let's take a look." I watched her eyes scan the monitor. Her warm smile slowly faded, replaced by a deep, concerned frown. She clicked her mouse a few more times, her brow furrowing. "Chloe, there seems to be a mistake. Or perhaps you forgot." I leaned forward, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Forgot what? What does it say?" Brenda turned the monitor slightly, so I could see the screen. "Your balance is 0. The entire $150,000 was wired out of the account last Tuesday." The sterile walls of the bank manager's office felt like they were rapidly closing in on me. The numbers on the screen blurred as all the air rushed out of my lungs. $0. 00. I blinked, hoping the screen would miraculously change. "No," I whispered. "No, that's impossible. I didn't authorize a wire transfer. Where did the money go?" Brenda's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up the transaction history. "The funds were transferred to a joint checking account held by Susan and Richard," she said softly, looking at me with profound pity. "My parents. They had taken everything. Every single dime my grandfather had saved for my future instantly vanished to pay for floral arrangements and custom ice sculptures. The sheer scale of the betrayal paralyzed me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. My own mother and father had completely financially ruined me just to give their golden child a fairy tale party. A blinding, white-hot rage finally broke through my shock as I stormed out of the bank. I drove to my parents' house like a woman possessed. I didn't even bother knocking. I shoved the front door open, the heavy wood slamming violently against the wall. Susan and Brittany were sitting at the kitchen island, happily addressing thick, gold-foiled wedding invitations. They both jumped at the loud noise. "Chloe, what on earth is wrong with you?" Susan snapped, pressing a hand to her chest. I marched right up to the island, slamming my palms down on the marble counter. "Where is it?" I screamed, my voice cracking with absolute fury. "Where's my grandfather's trust fund?" The color instantly drained from Brittany's face. She looked down at the expensive invitations, suddenly fascinated by the calligraphy. Susan, however, remained entirely calm. She let out a long, exasperated sigh and set her pen down. "Chloe, please lower your voice. The neighbors can hear you." I stared at her, completely unashamed of my rage. "You stole $150,000 from me. You drained my entire account." Susan narrowed her eyes, stepping into my personal space. "We didn't steal anything," she hissed. attempting to gaslight me with a terrifyingly calm demeanor. We borrowed it. You know how much pressure we are under with the wedding. Mark's parents expect a certain standard. Family shares everything, Chloe. You weren't even using that money right now anyway. The absolute delusion in her voice made me physically nauseous. It wasn't yours to borrow. It was my house. My future. Brittany finally spoke up, rolling her eyes. Oh, stop being so dramatic, Chloe. We'll pay you back eventually. God, you are always so incredibly selfish. Can't you just be a team player for my special day? I looked back and forth between my mother and my sister, realizing for the very first time that they truly did not care about me. I was nothing more than an ATM to them. They expected me to simply roll over, accept the theft, and smile for the wedding photos. I walked out of that house knowing I would never look at my family the same. The initial adrenaline crash left me completely exhausted, but I knew I couldn't afford to sit in my apartment and cry. The next morning, I went straight back to the bank and demanded a private meeting with the regional fraud investigator. If my parents had simply sweet-talked me into giving them the money, it would be a civil dispute. But I hadn't given them anything. I needed to know exactly how they managed to bypass the bank's security protocols to drain a six-figure trust fund. The investigator, a stern man in a gray suit, pulled the physical wire transfer authorization forms from their archives. He slid a piece of paper across the desk. This was submitted in person at our downtown branch, he explained, pointing to the bottom of the page. The teller verified the identification provided. I looked down at the signature line. It was my name, signed in a shaky, practiced cursive that looked vaguely like my handwriting, but was entirely fake. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. That is not my signature, I said quietly. The investigator frowned. The woman who authorized the wire transfer provided your social security number, your date of birth, and a state-issued ID. It hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My mother hadn't just borrowed the funds by exploiting some banking loophole. She had stolen my birth certificate and my social security card from her old filing cabinet. She had actively impersonated me, forged my legal signature on a federal banking document, and wired the money to herself. This wasn't just a toxic family dispute over wedding expenses anymore. This was a calculated, premeditated federal crime. Susan had committed felony identity theft and massive wire fraud. The investigator looked at me, his expression deadly serious, and asked if I wanted to file a formal police report for fraud. If I said yes, the authorities would immediately open a criminal investigation into my own parents. I asked for copies of every single forged document and told them I needed a lawyer. I spent the entire weekend researching the most aggressive, ruthless civil litigation attorneys in the city. That's how I found Lawyer Davis. He was in his late 40s, sharp, cynical, and specialized in high-stakes financial fraud and asset recovery. I sat in his imposing, mahogany-paneled office and slid the folder of bank documents across his desk. I explained the golden child dynamic, the absurd wedding demands, and the forged signature on the wire transfer. Davis reviewed the documents in total silence for 10 minutes. When he finally looked up, his eyes were gleaming with a predatory focus. Your mother is looking at multiple federal charges, Davis stated bluntly, leaning back in his leather chair. Wire fraud, identity theft, and forgery. If we take this to the police right now, she is looking at real prison time. I swallowed hard. The moral dilemma was terrifying. Despite everything, she was still my mother. The thought of sending her to a federal penitentiary made my stomach churn. Is there any way to just get the money back without destroying them? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Davis shook his head, his expression entirely devoid of pity. Chloe, they didn't just make a mistake. They deliberately stole your future to buy flowers and champagne. By the time we file a standard civil suit, they will have spent the entire 150 grand. The only way to freeze their assets and force an immediate settlement is to leverage the criminal charges. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. But right now, it's just your word against hers regarding the forgery. A good defense attorney might argue you gave verbal consent and are just suffering from buyer's remorse. I felt a sudden wave of panic. So what do we do? I asked desperately. Davis smiled, a cold, calculating grin that sent shivers down my spine. He told me I had to go back into the snake pit and gather a confession. The strategy Davis laid out was absolutely brutal, but entirely necessary. I had to play the role of the subdued, forgiving, easily manipulated younger sister. I needed to lower their defenses and trick them into admitting to the financial crimes in writing. It was the hardest acting job of my entire life. That evening, I sat on my couch, staring at my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely type. I opened a group text with Susan and Brittany. I took a deep breath and sent the bait. Hey guys, I've been thinking. I'm still really hurt about the trust fund, but I don't want to ruin the wedding. I just need to understand how the loan is going to work. How much of the $150,000 did you take, and when can I expect it back? I hit send and tossed the phone onto the cushion, feeling completely sick to my stomach. I waited for what felt like hours. I paced the floor, terrified that Susan would realize it was a trap and call me instead of texting back. If she confessed over the phone, it was useless. I needed undeniable, written proof. Finally, the screen lit up with a notification. It was a reply from Susan. My heart hammered as I read her words. Chloe, thank you for being mature about this. We transferred the full $150,000 out on Tuesday. We had to use your old Social Security card at the branch to get it done quickly before the floral vendors canceled. We will try to pay you back in installments after the honeymoon. Love you. I stared at the screen, my jaw completely unhinged. She had just casually admitted to identity theft and wire fraud via text message. But before I could even take a screenshot, my phone buzzed again with a message from Brittany, and it was even better. The golden child was completely incapable of keeping her mouth shut when her ego was involved. Her entitlement was about to be the final nail in their legal coffin, sealing their absolute destruction. I opened my sister's text message and realized she had just handed me the smoking gun. Brittany's text message was a masterclass in narcissistic delusion. She wrote, "Honestly, Chloe, you should be thanking us. Granddad's money was just sitting there doing nothing. We used $20,000 of your fund just on the imported orchids today. My wedding is going to be the event of the decade. Mark's family is extremely high society, and we couldn't look cheap. We signed the papers because you were being entirely too stubborn to see the big picture. Stop whining about a house you don't even need yet, and just be happy for me." I read the paragraph 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Not only had she confirmed the exact amount of stolen money and what it was being wasted on, but she explicitly admitted that they forged the paperwork because I was being stubborn. She had completely implicated herself as an accessory to the fraud. I carefully took high-resolution screenshots of the entire conversation, making sure the timestamps and contact information were clearly visible. I immediately emailed the files to Lawyer Davis. Within 5 minutes, my phone rang. It was Davis. "I have the screenshots," he said, his voice practically vibrating with professional excitement. "This is a goldmine, Chloe. They didn't just confess. They provided the motive, the method, and the timeline in their own words. We have them absolutely dead to rights." I felt a strange mixture of immense relief and profound sorrow. The trap had worked flawlessly, but it also meant there was no going back. My family was truly broken beyond repair. "So what happens now?" I asked, looking around my quiet, empty apartment. "Now," Davis replied smoothly, "I draft the civil lawsuit for grand theft and conversion, and I prepare the criminal evidence binder for the district attorney's fraud division." He paused for a moment, letting the gravity of the situation settle over me. "The wedding is in exactly 48 hours, correct?" he asked. I confirmed the date. He promised me that my sister's extravagant rehearsal dinner was going to be an unforgettable event. The next 48 hours were a chaotic blur of intense legal preparation. I sat in Davis's office as his paralegals rapidly assembled thick, heavy binders of evidence. The civil lawsuit was brutal. We were suing Susan, my father, and Brittany for the full $150,000, plus maximum punitive damages for emotional distress and fraud. Simultaneously, Davis was finalizing a formal criminal complaint to submit to the police department the following Monday. But the most crucial element was the delivery. Davis hired a specialized, highly aggressive process server, a guy named Rick who had a reputation for finding people in the most inconvenient, public places imaginable. "We want maximum psychological impact," Davis explained, sliding a photo of the country club venue across the table. "If we serve them privately, they will try to hide the assets, deny the lawsuit, and lie to Mark's wealthy family about what happened. We need to completely shatter their facade in front of their most important audience." I nodded, my stomach twisting with nervous energy. The plan was to execute the legal strike during the rehearsal dinner on Friday night. Mark's entire extended family, dozens of wealthy, influential people, would be in attendance. It was the exact crowd my mother and sister had sacrificed my future to impress. I spent Friday afternoon getting ready in my apartment. I put on a simple, dark dress and stared at myself in the mirror. For 26 years, I had kept my head down, absorbed their insults, and played the role of the quiet, compliant scapegoat. But the girl staring back at me in the mirror was done being a victim. I felt a cold, hard resolve settle deep in my chest. I grabbed my purse and drove toward the Oakwood Country Club, watching the sun dip below the city skyline. The storm was coming, and I was the one bringing the lightning. I pulled into the valet parking lot, ready to watch my family's fake empire burn down. Walking into the Oakwood Country Club felt like stepping onto a movie set. The ballroom was completely dripping in sickening extravagance. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a soft, romantic light over dozens of round tables draped in imported silk linens. The $20,000 orchids my sister had bragged about were arranged in towering, obnoxious centerpieces. I quietly took my seat at a small table near the back, observing the room. Mark's family dominated the space. His parents, aunts, and uncles were all dressed in understated, quiet luxury, sipping expensive wine and chatting politely. At the head table, Susan and Brittany were in their absolute element. They were glowing, laughing loudly, and playing the role of high society elites flawlessly. My father sat quietly beside them, looking slightly pale, perhaps silently calculating the mountain of illegal debt they had just acquired. I checked my phone under the table. "Rick, the process server, texted me. I am in the lobby, waiting for your signal." My heart was beating so loudly, I thought the people next to me could hear it. Toward the end of the dinner, the room began to quiet down as the waitstaff poured champagne for the toasts. Brittany stood up, looking radiant in a custom white silk cocktail dress. She tapped her crystal flute with a silver spoon, demanding everyone's immediate attention. "I just want to say a few words," Brittany announced, her voice echoing perfectly through the ballroom. "To Mark's wonderful family, thank you for welcoming me. And to my parents, thank you for giving me the wedding of my absolute dreams. I am so blessed to have a perfect, supportive family who would do anything for me." The sheer hypocrisy of her words made the blood roar in my ears. I pulled out my phone and quickly typed a single letter to Rick. "Go." I watched the heavy mahogany doors swing open as the man in the gray suit entered. Rick moved through the crowded ballroom with terrifying, calculated purpose. He ignored the waitstaff and marched directly toward the head table. The room was still completely silent, everyone's attention focused on Brittany's toast. Rick bypassed the floral arrangements and stepped right up behind my mother's chair. "Susan?" he asked loudly, his voice easily carrying across the quiet room. Susan turned around, a confused, polite smile plastered on her face, expecting a question from a venue manager. "Yes," she replied. Rick slammed a massive, thick legal folder directly onto her dinner plate, scattering her food. "You've been served," he announced flatly. He immediately turned to my father, dropping a second heavy folder onto his lap. "You've been served." Finally, Rick stepped up to Brittany, who was still holding her champagne glass in midair, completely frozen in shock. He slapped the final legal binder onto the table right in front of her. "Brittany, you have been served with a civil lawsuit for grand theft, conversion, and fraud. Have a great night." Rick didn't wait for a response. He spun around and walked out of the ballroom, the heavy doors shutting loudly behind him. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and deafening. Mark, who was sitting right next to Brittany, stared at the massive legal documents sitting on the table. The words "civil complaint for fraud" were printed in bold, massive black letters on the cover pages. Susan let out a strangled gasp, her hands shaking violently as she stared at her folder. Brittany lowered her champagne glass, her perfect complexion turning a sickly, ashen gray. She looked out into the crowd, her eyes wide with sheer panic, and finally locked eyes with me sitting quietly at the back table. I didn't flinch. I just stared back at her with absolutely zero expression on my face, watching her perfect world crumble. Mark's wealthy father stood up from his table, demanding to know exactly what was going on. Absolute chaos erupted in the ballroom. Mark's father, a formidable corporate CEO, marched straight up to the head table and snatched the folder right off his son's plate. He flipped open the cover page and started reading the summary aloud. Grand theft? Identity fraud? Forgery of federal bank documents? He boomed, his voice echoing through the massive room. Mark looked at Brittany, his face pale and completely bewildered. Brittany, what is he talking about? Did you steal money? Brittany burst into hysterical, theatrical tears. No, Mark, it's a lie. My sister is crazy. She's just jealous and trying to ruin my wedding, she screamed, pointing a shaking finger across the room at me. Susan scrambled out of her chair, trying to grab the folder out of Mark's father's hands. Please, this is a private family misunderstanding. We just borrowed some funds. Mark's father stepped back, his eyes narrowing in total disgust. Borrowed? This says you forged your younger daughter's signature to drain her trust fund to pay for this rehearsal dinner. He threw the folder back onto the table in disgust. The illusion was completely shattered. Mark's family, old money and highly protective of their reputation, looked at my parents like they were diseased. Mark stood up, his breathing ragged. He looked at the $20,000 floral arrangements, the expensive champagne, and then down at the crying woman he was supposed to marry in less than 48 hours. You funded our wedding with stolen money, Mark whispered, the betrayal evident in his voice. You lied to me. You let me think your parents were paying for this honestly. Brittany tried to grab his arm, sobbing uncontrollably, but Mark ripped his hand away. With trembling fingers, he pulled the engagement ring off his hand, dropped it onto the legal binder, and walked out without looking back. The entire groom's side of the room quietly stood up and followed Mark out the door. The fallout was swift, brutal, and incredibly public. The wedding was permanently canceled the next morning. Without Mark's family's financial backing, my parents were left holding the bag for dozens of uncancelable vendor contracts, totaling well over $80,000. But the vendor debt was the least of their problems. On Monday morning, Lawyer Davis submitted the criminal evidence binder to the district attorney. Because they had forged federal bank documents and crossed state lines with wire fraud, the authorities took the case extremely seriously. 3 weeks later, Susan was formally arrested for felony identity theft and wire fraud. My father, who had actively participated in spending the stolen money, was charged as an accessory. The civil lawsuit moved incredibly fast. Faced with undeniable written confessions and the threat of severe criminal penalties, their defense attorney advised them to surrender immediately. The court ordered them to completely liquidate all of their remaining assets to pay me back. They were forced to sell our childhood home at a massive loss just to cover my stolen trust fund and their mounting legal fees. Brittany's life completely imploded. Mark refused to speak to her ever again, blocking her number and moving to a different city. Her reputation in our social circles was completely annihilated. Nobody wants to be friends with a woman who helps steal her own sister's inheritance for a party. She had to move into a tiny, run-down apartment, taking a minimum-wage retail job just to survive. My parents, bankrupt, disgraced, and facing probation and potential jail time, moved into a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city. The perfect, image-obsessed family facade they had sacrificed my future to maintain had been completely and utterly destroyed by their own toxic greed. They had gambled everything on the assumption that I would stay silent and compliant, but they severely underestimated the strength of a scapegoat who has absolutely nothing left to lose. I watched them pack up their house, feeling absolutely zero pity for the monsters they were. It has been 2 years since the chaotic implosion at the rehearsal dinner. I successfully recovered the entire $150,000, plus an additional settlement for legal fees and emotional distress. Last month, I finally used my grandfather's gift exactly as he intended. I closed on a beautiful, modest starter home with a big backyard and a wraparound porch. Standing in my empty living room, holding the shiny brass keys, I finally felt a profound sense of peace. I haven't spoken a single word to Susan, my father, or Brittany since the night the process server dropped those folders on their plates. They are completely blocked on every platform. I learned the hard way that toxic family members will always use your loyalty as a weapon against you. They will demand that you set yourself on fire just to keep them warm, and then complain about the smell of the smoke. If you are the scapegoat in your family, if you are constantly being asked to sacrifice your boundaries, your finances, or your mental health for the sake of the golden child, please hear this. You owe them absolutely nothing. Blood does not give anyone a free pass to abuse you. It takes a terrifying amount of courage to stand up and break the cycle, but the freedom waiting for you on the other side is worth every single moment of the fight. My grandfather wanted me to have a strong foundation, and thanks to Lawyer Davis and my own refusal to back down, I finally built one. The legal justice was satisfying, but the personal healing was the true victory. I filled my new home with friends who genuinely care about me, creating a chosen family that respects my boundaries and celebrates my successes instead of trying to exploit them. I lost my biological family, but I gained my absolute independence, my self-respect, and a future they can never steal. Every time I walk through my front door, I know I earned this peace. The truth always finds a way out, and revenge is incredibly sweet when it is legal.